My name is Daniel, and I live in a small town called Green Valley. It is a quiet place with small houses, green trees, narrow streets, a beautiful river, one school, one hospital, a small train station, 2 supermarkets, and many little shops. I have lived there all my life, and for 24 years, Green Valley was my whole world. I knew every street, every shopkeeper, the best trees for shade, the deep and shallow parts of the river, and even the sound of the old train that passed through the town every morning. But I always wanted to see something different. I wanted to travel, meet new people, see big cities, tall buildings, mountains, and the ocean. Most importantly, I wanted to discover who I really was. I worked at my father's small grocery store, Green Valley Market. Every morning, I woke up at 6, washed my face, made tea, and walked to the store. My father usually arrived before me. He was a quiet man with gray hair and kind eyes. "Good morning, Daniel," he would say. "Good morning, Dad," I would answer. Then we opened the store together. For years, my life remained the same. Monday was like Tuesday, Tuesday was like Wednesday, and nothing ever changed. I was comfortable, but I was not happy. One evening, after closing the store, I sat outside with my father while the sun went down and the sky turned orange and pink. A cool wind came from the river, and my father looked at me. "You look worried," he said. "I am thinking about my future," I replied. When he asked what I was thinking about, I finally told him, "Dad, I want to travel." He looked surprised and asked where I wanted to go. "I don't know. Somewhere far away," I said. I explained that I felt like I was standing in the same place and wanted to learn new things and experience life. My father looked toward the river and quietly said, "When I was your age, I wanted to travel too." I was surprised. He told me that he had once dreamed of seeing the world, but my grandfather became sick, so he stayed to help his family. When I asked if he regretted it, he thought for a few seconds and said, "No. But sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had traveled." His words stayed in my mind that night. I could not sleep, and after staring at the ceiling for a long time, I finally made a decision. I would travel. I did not know where I would go, how long I would stay away, or what would happen, but I knew I had to try. The next morning, I searched for a job in the city, and a week later, I found one at a small hotel near the center of a large city called Brookdale. The hotel needed a receptionist. The salary was not very high, but it was enough for me, so I accepted the job. When I told my father, he smiled and said, "I am proud of you." I asked if he was sad, and he replied, "Of course, you are my son, but I am also happy." 3 days later, I packed my clothes into a small suitcase. My father helped me, and then gave me an old silver watch that had belonged to my grandfather. I told him I could not take something so important, but he said, "Exactly, that is why you should take it." I carefully placed the watch in my bag. The next morning, my father and I walked to the small train station. Only a few people were waiting. An old woman on a bench, a young couple near the ticket office, and a man carrying 2 large bags. I looked back at my town, and for the first time, Green Valley seemed very small. My father put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't be afraid." I told him I was not afraid, but he smiled and said, "You are a terrible liar." We laughed together. Then the train arrived. I hugged my father, and he told me to take care of myself. I told him to do the same, then stepped onto the train and found a seat beside the window. As the train moved, I watched my father become smaller and smaller until the station disappeared. Then the houses, trees, and finally Green Valley disappeared behind me. I took a deep breath. My journey had begun. The train arrived in Brookdale at 5 in the afternoon. I stepped onto the platform with my suitcase and immediately noticed the noise. Hundreds of people were everywhere. Cars moved through busy streets. People walked quickly. Buses stopped and left. Phones rang, and voices filled the air. I stood there for a few seconds, completely lost. In Green Valley, the train station was almost always quiet, but here, it felt as if the whole world was running. I checked the address of my hotel, which I had written on a piece of paper. Sunrise Hotel, 18 King Street. I saw a taxi and walked toward it. "Excuse me," I said to the driver. "Do you know King Street?" "Of course," he replied. I showed him the address, and he placed my suitcase in the car. As we drove through the city, I looked through the window in amazement. I had never seen buildings so tall. Some seemed to touch the sky. Bright signs covered the streets. Restaurants were full of people. Shops were open, and music came from small cafes. I felt excited, but I was also nervous. After about 20 minutes, the taxi stopped. "Here we are," the driver said. I paid him, took my suitcase, and looked at the hotel. It was not very large. It had 3 floors and a blue sign above the door that read, "Sunrise Hotel." I opened the door and saw a young woman sitting behind the reception desk. She smiled and asked, "Hello, can I help you?" I introduced myself and explained that I was there for the receptionist job. Her smile became bigger. "Oh, you are Daniel." She introduced herself as Emma and welcomed me to Sunrise Hotel. She showed me around. The hotel was simple but comfortable. It had 10 rooms, a small restaurant, a kitchen, a living room for guests, and a small garden behind the building. Emma explained that I would work with her, usually from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, although some days could be busy. She then gave me a small key and showed me my room upstairs. I was surprised to learn that the hotel had a small room for staff. My new room was simple, with a bed, a table, a chair, and a window, but I was happy because it was my first home in a new city. That evening, I went downstairs and found Emma sitting in the garden drinking coffee. She offered me some, and I sat beside her. She asked why I had come to Brookdale. I told her I wanted a change and explained that I was from a small town called Green Valley. She had never heard of it, so I described it as a very quiet place. Then she asked if I missed it. I looked at the sky and admitted that I thought I already did. Emma smiled and told me I would get used to the city. The next morning was my first day at work. I woke up early, put on my cleanest shirt, looked at myself in the mirror, and said, "You can do this." Then I went downstairs. My first guest arrived at 8:30. He was an older man carrying a brown suitcase. I greeted him and asked if he had a reservation. He said his name was Mr. Wilson, so I checked the computer and found his booking. I gave him the key to room 5 and explained that breakfast was served from 7 to 10. He thanked me, smiled, and noticed that I was new. He told me not to worry because I looked like a nice young man. I thanked him and he went upstairs. At first, I thought the job would be easy, but I was wrong. At 10 o'clock, 3 guests arrived at the same time. One had lost his reservation, another wanted a taxi, and the third wanted to know where the best restaurant was. I tried to help everyone, but I made several mistakes. I forgot one guest's name and gave another guest the wrong room number. Emma helped me solve the problems. By the end of the day, I was completely exhausted. I sat in the garden and Emma brought me a glass of water. When she asked how my first day had been, I honestly said, "Terrible." She laughed and told me it had not been terrible. I said I had made so many mistakes and felt stupid, but she reminded me that everyone makes mistakes and that I was learning. Then she told me that she had once given a guest the key to her own room. The guest opened the door while she was sleeping. We both laughed, and for the first time that day, I finally felt relaxed. I realized that maybe I could learn, maybe I could become good at the job, and maybe I could build a new life in Brookdale. I had left Green Valley because I wanted to discover who I really was. And now, standing in the small garden of the Sunrise Hotel, I understood that the journey was only beginning. 3 weeks passed, and I became much better at my job. I learned the names of regular guests, how to answer difficult questions, how to use the hotel computer, and even some shortcuts around the city. But one guest was different. His name was Mr. Thomas, and he stayed in room 7. He arrived every Friday evening and left every Sunday morning at exactly the same times. He always carried a black backpack, had short gray hair, wore glasses, and spoke very little. He never ate in the hotel restaurant, never talked to other guests, and usually went straight to his room. One Friday evening, he arrived as usual. I greeted him, and he surprisingly remembered my name. Before going upstairs, he stopped and asked, "Daniel, do you like stories?" I smiled and said that I did. He simply replied, "Good," and walked away. I spent the night wondering why he had asked me that. The next morning, he came downstairs carrying his black backpack and placed an old brown book on the reception desk. The book looked very old, and its pages were yellow. When I asked what it was, he said, a story about a journey." I opened the book and noticed a name written inside, Daniel. I looked at him in confusion and asked why my name was there. He smiled and said, "Because this book belongs to you." I did not understand, so he told me to read the first page. It said, "Sometimes the longest journey begins with one small step." When I asked what it meant, he only smiled and said, "You will understand later." Then he left the hotel. I took the book to my room that evening and started reading. The story was about a young man who left his small village to find a better life. His journey was difficult. He met strangers, lost money, became sick, made mistakes, and faced many problems. But he continued moving forward. The more I read, the more I felt connected to him. He was afraid of the future, missed his family, wanted to return home, but at the same time wanted to discover the world. I read until midnight, and the next morning I woke up thinking about the story. I wanted to ask Mr. Thomas many questions, but he had already left. I waited impatiently for the following Friday. When he arrived, I ran to the reception desk and told him that I had read the book. He smiled and asked if I liked it. I told him that I loved it and asked where he had found it. He said it was a long story. I laughed and told him that I liked long stories. He promised that perhaps one day he would tell me. Then I asked why he had given the book to me. He looked toward the hotel door and said, "Because I think you need it." When I asked why, he said, "Because you are searching for something." I became silent. He walked upstairs, leaving me alone behind the reception desk. His words stayed in my mind. Maybe he was right. I had left Green Valley because I wanted something more. But what exactly was I searching for? 2 months after I arrived in Brookdale, a serious problem appeared. The hotel owner, Mrs. Parker, called me into her office. She looked worried and told me that the hotel was losing a lot of money. I immediately asked what would happen. She explained that she might have to sell the hotel because business was difficult. Two large hotels nearby had more rooms and lower prices, making it hard for Sunrise Hotel to compete. I was shocked. Sunrise Hotel was no longer just a workplace to me. It had become my new home. Emma worked there, Mr. Thomas stayed there, and I had finally begun to feel that I belonged somewhere outside Green Valley. I went downstairs and told Emma the news. She was upset too, and said that they could not lose the place. I did not know what to do. But that evening I sat alone in the garden and thought about my father. I remembered his words. Sometimes you have to try. The next morning, I decided to do exactly that. I created a simple page for the hotel on the internet. I took photographs of the rooms, the garden, and the restaurant. I wrote about the friendly staff and the peaceful atmosphere. Then Emma and I asked guests to leave honest reviews. We improved the breakfast, cleaned the garden, painted the front door, and placed flowers near the entrance. Little by little, things started to change. 1 week later, we received 3 new bookings. The next week, we received 5, and then 8. Mrs. Parker was surprised and asked how we had done it. I told her that we had listened to our guests. She smiled and said, "You're good at this." I felt proud, but I knew the hotel still needed many more guests to survive. Then I remembered Mr. Thomas and his words about taking one small step. Maybe Sunrise Hotel needed one bigger step. I asked Emma to help me create a special weekend package that included breakfast, a city tour, and a free dinner. We advertised it online, but at first nothing happened. I began to worry that our idea had failed. Then one morning, my phone rang. It was a travel company interested in booking 6 rooms for 3 nights. I could hardly believe it. I confirmed the booking, and that single opportunity changed everything. Soon, more bookings arrived. The hotel became busy again, and Mrs. Parker decided not to sell it. Sunrise Hotel had survived. That evening, everyone celebrated in the garden. Emma brought a cake, and Mrs. Parker opened a bottle of sparkling water. Even Mr. Thomas came downstairs. He looked at me and smiled before saying, "Well done." I looked at him and asked if he had known that everything would work out. He shook his head and said, "No." I asked why he had been smiling then. He simply replied, "Because you were willing to try." His words made me think deeply. When I first left Green Valley, I believed that traveling would help me discover who I was. I thought the answers might be waiting in a big city, in a new job, or somewhere far away from home. But now I was beginning to understand something different. Maybe discovering yourself was not about finding one perfect place or one perfect answer. Maybe it was about facing problems, making mistakes, helping people, and continuing even when you were afraid. I remembered the sentence from the old book. Sometimes the longest journey begins with one small step. I realized that my journey had started with a train ride from Green Valley, but it was continuing every day through the choices I made. I had taken one small step when I left home, another when I accepted the hotel job, and another when I decided to help save Sunrise Hotel. I did not know where my journey would take me next, but for the first time, I was not worried about knowing the entire path. I only needed to take the next step. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. One morning, I received a letter with no return address. My name was written on the front, Daniel Carter. Inside was a short message from a woman named Margaret, who said she knew my father and that many years ago he had helped her family. She was now living in Brookdale and wanted to meet me at the old library on Saturday At 3 o'clock, I immediately called my father and asked if he knew someone named Margaret. After a moment of silence, he asked if I meant Margaret Rose. When I confirmed that possibility, he sounded surprised and told me that she had been a friend of our family. He explained that many years ago, her family's house had burned down, and my grandfather had helped them. I decided to meet her, although my father strangely told me to be careful. On Saturday afternoon, I went to the old library, a beautiful building with large windows that smelled of old books. Near one of the windows sat a woman who looked about 70 years old. She had white hair and a gentle face. When I introduced myself as Daniel, she smiled and said I looked just like my father. After we sat down, she took a small box from her bag and opened it. Inside was an old photograph showing my grandfather standing beside a young woman. I immediately realized that the young woman was Mrs. Rose. She explained that when she was 19, her family had lost everything in a terrible fire. My grandfather had found them a place to stay, given them food, and helped her father find work. I asked why she was telling me about this after so many years. She said she had recently found something important. She showed me another photograph of my grandfather standing with a group of people. On the back was a handwritten message. One day, help someone who needs you. Mrs. Rose explained that my grandfather believed kindness should continue from one person to another. He had helped her family. Her family later helped another family, and that family helped someone else. Kindness moves from one person to another, she told me. As I listened, I thought about my own journey. My father had helped me leave Green Valley. Mr. Thomas had given me the mysterious book. I had helped save Sunrise Hotel. And now Mrs. Rose was giving me a piece of my family's history. Maybe all these events were connected. Before I left, Mrs. Rose gave me the photograph and told me to keep it. I said I could not take something so important, but she smiled and said, "Because now it is your turn." When I walked out of the library, I felt different. I had traveled far from Green Valley, but somehow my family's history had followed me. I began to understand that my journey was not only about discovering new places, it was also about discovering the values that had shaped my family for generations. Life at Sunrise Hotel continued to improve. Business was good. I had more responsibilities. Mrs. Parker trusted me, and Emma had become one of my closest friends. Yet, despite everything going well, I still felt that something was missing. One evening, Emma and I sat together in the garden, and she noticed that I seemed quiet. I told her that I was thinking about going home to Green Valley because I missed my father. She suggested that I simply visit him, but I admitted that I was not sure whether I wanted to stay in Brookdale anymore. I had come to the city because I wanted to discover myself, but now I felt that I still did not completely understand who I was. Emma laughed when I said this and told me that realizing you do not know yourself might actually be a good beginning. Then she became serious and reminded me that I did not have to make every decision immediately. She said that people often think life is one huge decision, when perhaps life is actually made of many small decisions. Her words reminded me of Mr. Thomas's book and its message about taking one small step at a time. The next morning, I called my father and told him that I wanted to come home for a few days. He was happy to hear it. I bought a train ticket and told Mrs. Parker that I was leaving for a short visit. She encouraged me to take my time and said I could return whenever I wanted. Emma hugged me and asked me to come back, and I promised that I would. Before I left, I spoke to Mr. Thomas. He asked if I was going home, And when I said yes, he simply replied, "Good." I asked whether he thought I was making the right decision. He smiled and told me that there was no perfect decision. When I asked how I could know what to choose, he answered, "You don't." I laughed and told him that his answer was not very helpful. He smiled and said, "Life is not a map." I asked what it was, and he replied, "A journey." Those words stayed with me as I boarded the train. The train arrived in Green Valley early in the morning. As I stepped onto the platform, everything looked familiar. The small station, the old benches, the trees, and the quiet road. I smiled when I saw my father waiting for me, and we hugged. He looked at me and said that I seemed different. I asked how, and he told me that I looked older. I laughed and reminded him that I had only been gone for 4 months. As we walked home, the streets seemed smaller than I remembered. My father noticed that I kept looking around and explained that sometimes a place feels smaller because you have grown. I thought about that for a long time. That afternoon, I helped him at the store just as I had done before leaving. Customers came and went. Everything looked normal, but I felt completely different. That evening, my father and I sat beside the river, and he asked me to tell him everything. I told him about Sunrise Hotel, Emma, Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Rose, and the old photographs. I told him about the mysterious book and everything that had happened since I left Green Valley. My father listened quietly and finally said that my grandfather would have been proud of me. Then he asked if I wanted to stay in Green Valley. I looked at the river and admitted that I did not know. My father said that was okay. After a moment, I told him that I thought I wanted to return to Brookdale. He smiled and told me to go back. I worried about leaving him alone, but he laughed and said he had his customers. Then he became serious and explained that he had always wanted me to have a life bigger than the grocery store. He told me to go and build my own life. Before I returned to Brookdale, he gave me an old notebook that had belonged to my grandfather. Inside were ideas, names, small drawings, and short sentences written many years ago. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Your life becomes meaningful when you use it to help others. I closed the notebook and understood what my journey had really been about. I had originally left Green Valley because I wanted to see the world and discover who I was. I thought the answer would come from traveling to a big city, meeting new people, and experiencing a different life. But now I understood that a meaningful life was not simply about where you went. It was about what you did along the way, the people you helped, the kindness you received, and the kindness you chose to give to others. My journey had taken me away from home, but it had also helped me understand what home truly meant. Green Valley was not just the place where I had grown up. It was the place that had given me my values, my family, and the courage to take my first step. Now I was ready to return to Brookdale, not because I was running away from home, but because I finally understood that home would always be a part of me wherever I went. When I returned to Brookdale, Mr. Thomas was waiting for me at the hotel. He smiled and said, "You're back?" I told him I was, and he asked whether I had found what I was looking for. I smiled and said, "I think so." When he asked what I had found, I answered, "Myself." He nodded as if he had expected that answer. Then I finally asked the question that had been in my mind for months. "Why did you give me that book?" Mr. Thomas sat down and quietly told me that he had written it himself. I was shocked and asked if he had really written the entire book. He said yes. When I asked why, He explained that many years ago, he had been just like me. He had wanted to leave his hometown, and unlike me, he had actually done it. He traveled for many years and visited many countries. I told him that sounded amazing, and he agreed that it had been. Then I asked what he had learned from traveling so much. He smiled and said that people everywhere were surprisingly similar. No matter where they lived, people wanted love, safety, respect, and happiness. But he had learned something even more important. A person could travel around the entire world and still fail to understand himself. I thought about my own journey and asked what people should do instead. He told me to pay attention to people, to my choices, to my mistakes, and especially to the small moments. Then he pointed toward the garden and said, "That is where life happens." I smiled because I finally understood what he meant. I asked why he had stopped traveling, and his expression became quiet. He explained that his wife had become sick. He had stayed with her, and she eventually died 5 years earlier. After her death, he stopped traveling because he had lost his reason to do it. I felt sorry for him and did not know what to say. Then I asked why he was traveling again now. He smiled and said that he had found another reason. When I asked what it was, he looked directly at me and said, "You." I was surprised. He explained that I reminded him of himself when he was young, and he wanted to see if his story could help someone. I told him that it had helped me. He handed the old book back to me and said, "Then my journey was worth it." We sat quietly together for a while. The hotel was peaceful, and the sound of the garden outside made the moment feel special. Finally, I thanked him. He simply smiled and said, "You're welcome." At that moment, I realized that our lives could affect people in ways we never expected. Mr. Thomas had written a book because of his own journey, but years later, that same book had helped me find direction in mine. Perhaps that was what he meant when he said that kindness and meaning could move from one person to another. A month later, Mrs. Parker called me into her office with a smile and told me that she had good news. A travel company wanted to work with Sunrise Hotel. They planned to send groups of tourists to stay with us, around 20 people every month. I was amazed because only a few months earlier, we had been worried that the hotel might have to close. Now we were preparing to welcome large groups of visitors, but Mrs. Parker explained that there was one problem. The travel company wanted someone to organize tours for their guests. Then she looked at me and said, "You." I was surprised and asked why she had chosen me. She explained that I knew the city, understood the hotel, and knew what guests needed. I told her I could try, and she smiled and said, "That's why I chose you." The following weeks were extremely busy. I studied the history of Brookdale, visited museums, discovered good restaurants, explored quiet parks, and talked with local shop owners. I created walking tours and learned something new every day. I had arrived in Brookdale knowing almost nothing about the city, but now I was helping visitors discover it. One day, I took a group of tourists to an old bridge. A young woman in the group asked me how long I had lived in Brookdale. I told her that it had been about 5 months. She laughed and said that I already knew the city very well. I smiled and replied, "I am still learning." She told me that was a good thing. Her words stayed with me. I suddenly understood that learning never really ended. When I first left Green Valley, I believed that one day I would know enough, that eventually I would understand life, understand myself, and know exactly where I belonged. But now I realized that every new experience created another question. Every answer created another lesson, and every journey created another journey. Life was not about reaching a final point where everything became clear. It was about continuing to learn, continuing to grow, and being willing to take the next step. I looked around at the tourists standing on the old bridge, taking photographs and asking questions about the city. I thought about the small grocery store in Green Valley, my father, my grandfather's watch, Mrs. Rose, and her story of kindness, Emma, and the Sunrise Hotel, and Mr. Thomas with his mysterious book. All of those people and moments had shaped me. I had left home, believing that I needed to travel far away to find myself. But the truth was that I had found myself through the people I met and the choices I made. I had learned that courage did not mean having no fear. It meant taking the next step even when you were afraid. I had learned that success did not always come from having a perfect plan. Sometimes it came from simply trying when everyone else believed something was impossible. I had learned that home was not a place you had to leave behind. It was something you carried with you. And most importantly, I had learned that a meaningful life was not measured by how far you traveled, how much money you earned, or how many places you visited. It was measured by the people you helped, the kindness you gave, the lessons you learned, and the person you became along the way. I still wanted to see the ocean, the mountains, and many more cities. I still wanted to travel and experience the world. But now I was no longer traveling because I was trying to escape the life I had known. I was traveling because I wanted to continue learning. My journey had started in a small town called Green Valley, with a young man sitting beside a river and wondering if there was something more waiting for him. It had taken me to Brookdale, to Sunrise Hotel, to an old library, to a mysterious book, and into the stories of people I never expected to meet. And now, standing on an old bridge with a group of travelers around me, I knew that this was not the end of my story. It was only another beginning. 1 year after I left Green Valley, I returned home again. This time, I did not feel lost. I felt confident. I had a good job, good friends, and important responsibilities, but I still wanted to learn and grow. My father was standing outside the store when I arrived. He smiled and asked if I was staying. I told him I would stay for a few days, and he was happy. That evening, I showed him photographs from my life in Brookdale. The hotel, Emma, the tourists, the city, the garden, and Mr. Thomas. My father looked carefully at every photograph and told me that I had changed. I asked if that was a good thing, and he smiled and said it was very good. Then I gave him the old photograph I had received from Mrs. Rose. He became quiet and told me that he remembered it. I asked him to tell me about my grandfather, and he explained that he had been a kind man who always tried to help others. I asked whether my father had learned from him, and he said he had tried. Then I asked if my grandfather had ever given him advice. My father smiled and said, "Never be too busy to help someone." I immediately remembered the words written in my grandfather's notebook. Once again, I realized that kindness really did move from one person to another. That night I could not sleep, so I went outside and sat beside the quiet river under the bright moon. I thought about the person I had been 1 year earlier, a young man who was afraid to leave his hometown and believed he needed to find a perfect future. Now I understood that there was no perfect future. There was only the next step. My father came outside and sat beside me. He asked what I was thinking about, and I told him I was thinking about my journey. He asked if I regretted leaving Green Valley. I said never. Then he asked if I regretted coming back. Again, I said never. We smiled, and watch the river together, both understanding that sometimes you have to leave home before you can truly understand what home means. The next morning, I visited my old school and met my former teacher, Mr. Adams. He was surprised and happy to see me. We talked about my life in Brookdale, the hotel, the tours, and my travels. He listened carefully and told me that I was doing well. Then he asked me a question that made me think deeply. What was the most important thing you learned? I thought about everything I had experienced. I had learned how to work, travel, communicate, solve problems, meet strangers, and deal with difficult situations. But one answer seemed more important than all the others. I told him that I had learned that being afraid was normal. I explained that I had been afraid to leave home, but I left anyway. I had been afraid of making mistakes, but I made them anyway. I had been afraid of failing, but I tried anyway. Mr. Adams smiled proudly and told me that this was the most important lesson. Before I left, he gave me a small notebook and told me to write my journey in it, because one day, someone else might need my story. When I returned to Brookdale, I started writing. I wrote about Green Valley, my father, the train, Sunrise Hotel, Emma, Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Rose, my mistakes, my fear, my hope, and the kindness I had received from others. Most importantly, I wrote about the small steps that had changed my life. One evening, Emma came into the garden and asked what I was writing. I told her it was my story. She asked me to read something, so I opened the notebook and read the first page. I wrote that when I was 24, I thought I needed to find a better life and believed my life would change when I left my hometown. But I had been wrong. My life had not changed simply because I traveled. My life changed because I changed. The journey had not given me a new life. It had taught me how to live the life I already had. Emma listened quietly and told me that the words were beautiful. I told her that I wanted to turn my story into a book. I worried that it might take years, but she simply smiled and told me to do it. I realized she was right. Some things are worth starting, even when you do not know how long they will take. 6 months later, I received another letter from Mr. Thomas. He had left Brookdale and started traveling again. In his letter, he told me that I had once asked what made a journey meaningful, and he now believed he knew the answer. A journey was meaningful when you returned as a different person, not because you became richer, saw more places, or met famous people, but because you understood yourself better. He reminded me that I had learned to take risks, help others, and understand that fear was not a wall, but a door. He told me to open that door, walk through it, and keep going. Most importantly, he asked me to give courage to someone who was afraid to begin, just as someone had once given courage to me. I read his letter several times and placed it beside my grandfather's notebook. 2 men from different generations had given me the same lesson. Keep moving. Years passed. I stayed at Sunrise Hotel and eventually became its manager. Emma became my business partner. Mrs. Parker retired, and the hotel became one of the most popular small hotels in Brookdale. But I never forgot Green Valley. I visited my father often and helped him improve the grocery store. Eventually, we opened a small cafe beside the river called The First Step. People loved it. There were books on the shelves and photographs on the walls, including photographs of my grandfather, my father, and me standing at the train station. Beneath my photograph, I placed one sentence. Every journey begins with one small step. Young people often came into the cafe and talked about their dreams. Some wanted to study, some wanted to travel, some wanted to start businesses, and others simply wanted to change their lives. Many of them were afraid. One day, a young man sat across from me and said that he wanted to leave the town because he wanted to see the world. I told him to go. He asked what would happen if he failed, and I told him that he might. He asked what would happen if he got lost, and I told him that he probably would. He asked what would happen if he made mistakes, and I told him that he definitely would. Confused, he asked why he should go. I smiled and told him, "Because you will learn." Then I explained that I had been afraid many times, but each time I took one small step, then another, and then another. He thanked me and walked outside. I watched him disappear down the road and smiled. Maybe the journey was beginning again. Not mine, but his. Today I am older. I still travel, I still work, and I still learn. But I no longer believe that happiness is somewhere far away. Happiness can exist in a small town, a big city, a train, a hotel garden, a quiet river, or a simple conversation with a stranger. It can be found in helping someone and learning something new. My journey taught me that you do not need to know the entire road before you begin. You only need to know the next step. I learned that mistakes are not the end. They are lessons. I learned that being afraid does not mean you are weak. It means you care. I learned that people can change your life without even knowing it. A simple conversation can change someone. A small act of kindness can remain in someone's heart for years. A few words can give someone courage. I learned that home is important, but sometimes leaving home is important too. Sometimes you have to leave a familiar place to understand why you love it. Sometimes you have to lose something to understand its value. Sometimes you have to walk alone to discover who is walking beside you. And sometimes you have to stop searching for the perfect life and simply start living the life you already have. Take one small step, then another, then another. One day, you will look back and see how far you have come, and perhaps you will realize something beautiful. The journey was never taking you away from your life. The journey was teaching you how to live it.